Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today. It's good to be with you. I wanted to spend a minute to talk about a jig that I made that actually helps me get one side of a board real straight. And I thought I would talk through the materials that I use to build it, how I use it, what it's good for, what I like about this one in particular, and what I would do differently if I build another one. So sit back, relax, enjoy. We'll kind of walk through this and maybe at the end we'll see it in action. So this is a jig for running through a table saw. It'll run through the fence of the table saw, and once you clamp a board flat on here using these kind of hold downs, it'll make one kind of perfectly uniform edge. You can flip that edge over, put it against your fence, run it through the table saw, and now you've got two nice parallel sides of a board. But why would you need to do that? Well, it's kind of the first step for me before I can make any panels or joint anything to get that edge kind of cleaned up. I run a sawmill. A lot of the lumber that comes off the sawmill is rough sawn on the edges, and so this allows me to clean up or fix that one side, flip it over, make another good side, and once I'm done with that, I've got a piece of stock that resembles something you might buy from a lumber yard. I don't know how well the camera will pick it up, but this is what you can kind of see when it comes off of the sawmill. This side, the reason that it might not be perfectly straight, you tend to try to get it the best that you can off the sawmill. I used to try to get them perfect. I don't do that anymore. I just get them fairly good because as it dries, it might bow a little bit depending on whatever kind of tension is in the wood. And so I know now that I'm going to have this step later. I'm going to end up surfacing. You can see this is an area where this board is not as thick as the rest of the board. This is kind of what you would see as these saw marks going across for a bandsaw mill. And then obviously you could always have maybe a piece that at the tail end here would kind of come in a little bit. Maybe that board is not as long. And so this allows us to put it onto this jig, clean up this edge, make sure it's nice and straight in a hurry, and then obviously can joint it. I would say I originally saw this idea and they proposed that this would allow you to joint material and put it together. I don't think that it does a good enough job of that, only because it's going to ultimately, as you push through, if you have any sort of variances in pressure, you'll get those little teeth marks in the edge of the board. It'll leave kind of little, they're just barely like little bumps, and no matter how smooth you feed. So no matter what, I think you might be able to get 90% there. You're still going to hit that edge with a plain belt sander. You could put it on your jointer. It doesn't really matter, but you're going to need one more step here to take out any of the little saw marks that you'll get from the teeth on that edge. So here's an example of a board that might come off of the mill. For the most part, this has a uniform width to it, but at one little part, you can see that log had just a little dip in it. And so with the jig, it actually work out well. We could measure in from here. We'll figure out where this edge is, and if we wanted to square and take care of this and make sure that we had a nice straight edge on this board, we'll just move this out on the jig, and it'll take care of this little kind of irregular edge here, this sort of live edge that's coming from this board. We could also account for any large knots if we wanted to. If we were trying to make a really nice clean face and we wanted to take care of this guy, we could always run it through there just inside of this knot, get rid of that knot, and have a nice clean board. So especially if you had any knots on any edges, especially on the edge, this jig would do a great job of helping you eliminate those. So I thought I'd show you real quick. This is the jointer that I have. This doesn't have a very long bed to it. And so, as you can tell here, if I was going to feed this board onto it, the whole length of the board isn't supported on a bed. So if there's a bow or anything in this board, it's going to be difficult to continuously plane that out, because there's only so much of this board that's riding on a table as I feed this through the table. So if that bow is very slight and very gradual over the whole length of this board, this bed is not likely long enough to account for that. It will just ultimately follow it as it keeps going. Ideally, if you're really going to do this with any precision, you would have much longer in-feed and out-feed beds so that it stays on the same plane as you go through there and fix it. I don't have to worry about that with the jig. It kind of accounts for that, because once we put it on there, I could put about an 8-foot board on that jig, run it through the table saw, and make a uniform edge. And then I actually use the jointer to clean that edge to make sure that now I've got a square edge. I put it against that back fence. I make one more pass with this, take another 1/16 off. It takes care of any of those saw marks that are on it, and it makes sure that I have a nice perpendicular face to edge so that when I go to glue these up and make any panels, that I've got a good edge for joining. Let's take a look at the jig itself. It's a piece of PVC trim board. I got it from Lowe's. I'm sure Home Depot sells a similar one that I know of. I'm sure other places and suppliers have the same thing. It is a PVC, like plastic material, and it winds up being a little bit lightweight. And so that's what I like about it, is you're gonna add some weight when you add a board to it. So this, if you use something, you could use like a 3/4 inch birch plywood or something like that, but you're gonna make something that's fairly heavy. Some of the benefits of this are that this board isn't a full 8 feet long. And so this allows me to start some of the sort of this flat surface here, lets me start that on my in-feed part where my fence is, where the table saw face is. I can start into that before I even start the board. And if anyone's ever done this, sometimes if you have a very small saw bed or anything, it's very difficult to get this board exactly perfect when you start to feed that first part. Now, as you're kind of going along, it gets a lot easier, right? Because you've got a lot more surface to work from. But in the beginning, it's hard to have that feed be perfect. Well, this gives me maybe a foot of feed before I even get to the wood. So I've already kind of worked out a little bit of that, and I'm usually going into the fence a lot more straight, a lot more flat. So one of the things that will happen if you try to do this on the table saw, and it has a bow or curve in it, and you try to do it on the table saw, it actually, in my experience, is a bit dangerous, because as you're going, it's going to start to put pressure or pinch against that blade. So as you're feeding, if you started out and a board was one way, and as it goes, it starts to curve, you'll notice it'll start to wedge itself in and start to bind into that blade. And if you actually mount it onto this, you won't get that. As you're feeding it through, it's just going to take off a sort of a curved piece of wood here, a little bit of sliver, because this surface on this part of the jig is going to run perfectly parallel to your saw, perfectly parallel on the fence and everything. So it eliminates any of that kind of binding that you would get if your board starts to go in crooked or starts to have that bow and you're trying to account for that. So let's get this put into the jig, and I'll kind of show you a little bit of how it works. So this is just a track piece that I bought from Amazon, I believe, and then I used just wood screws. I think they're about 3/4 inch. It might be a little bit shy of 3/4 inch because this is pretty thin. But just make sure that they don't poke out the back, but make sure you also get quite a bit of bite into this trim piece. So you're going to take this board, this example here, if maybe you can see it right here. If I wanted to, I could, this is where a bug got in there and it has kind of a chunk out. So if we wanted, we could kind of measure over from here, or we could measure what that looks like and then set this into the jig to take this guy out. So you just put the board in, lift the little clamp ups, put it in, kind of make sure it's even going all the way down. The way that I sometimes do that is I'll measure from this face out, and then I'll go to the other end and measure and try to just kind of even it up a little bit. If you have a bit wider board, you can just make sure that you put this track on, put the track on very even to this side as well, and you can even use this as a fence to push the board against, and you'll see if you're straight or not, and then you can kind of clamp it down from there. Just be sure that it sort of protrudes or overhangs off the jig. You don't want to cut the jig, and so you'll make sure that there's at least maybe an inch or so or 2 inches sticking out on this edge of the board past this past the jig itself. So we've got our board clamped down. So how do we know what to set our saw fence at? So we can pull a tape off the back edge of this where the jig is at. This is what's going to sit against the fence. We can see here that the fence stops at about maybe 7 3/8 or so. So we've got plenty. We're all the way out at 8.5 out here. So if we want to set our fence, we might set our fence here at maybe 8 1/4 or maybe 8 3/8. 8 3/8 would pretty much just shave the edge of it there. And then you obviously want to check that at the other end as well to make sure you're somewhat even. If we measure over here, it will 8 3/8 also catch that other end. If that looks good, you'd set your fence at 8 3/8, and that's going to take off just this little face right here. All right, we've got our saw set up to 8 3/8 from the fence here to the blade. Make sure you wear safety equipment, eyes, ears, obviously. You only get one set of eyes. And then ears, you obviously want to be able to hear your grandkids when they get older, when you get older. So we're going to run this guy through here. Also, if you're afraid because I don't have any safety equipment, please understand these are, most of the stuff I get is a lot used, a lot older versions and models of things. So this is not going to have a lot of the safety equipment that you see it on a modern table saw. This is a pretty old grizzly table saw. Works great. I try to just use extra care, make sure I don't put my fingers where the sharp parts are, and be extra cautious the way I feed things through this. But we're going to go ahead and fire it up, and we're going to run this board through here and see if we can clean up this edge here, and then we'll see it in action. So as you can see, that took off just a sliver there, and you can actually see, I don't know if you can tell there, but it's thinner, obviously real thin on this end. It's thinner on this end, a little bit thicker on this end. So I may not have had it perfect on the jig, but it's going to be at least a straight and uniform edge that we can run through the joiner and get a nice clean face on it. I don't know if they're coming in the camera there, the detail wise, but let's see. Right in here, you can see a little bit of a saw mark where it kind of scrubbed. So that's the one thing you're left with that you have to clean up before you can joint a board. So a couple of things as you're building one of these to keep in mind is the little clamps. They will only work with a board that's so thick, and so I usually keep a couple of these just kind of 1x1 type sticks, and I have the ability to put this underneath it, so if I have a board that's thicker, I can then run that up and it'll clamp maybe a 2-inch board. It gives it a little bit more distance here for a thicker piece of wood, so you can still rip up to a 2-inch board or so, a 2-inch piece of stock through here. Remember, when you're putting this together, try to measure out, depending on the kit that you get, make sure you give yourself enough room where that back piece here can touch on the jig itself. As you kind of clamp down, it's going to need a surface there, so move it in, whatever this setup is going to be. This one's probably maybe a little over 1 inch or so in from the back side. It's about 1 1/8 in, so you can go 1 1/8, 1 1/4, somewhere in there, and it'll work pretty well. If I had to do over again, I think one of the things that I would do different is I'd probably just get 2 pieces of the track. The track for me doesn't go the entire length of the jig. You can see it kind of stops off here. I think the length on it's probably only a few feet. Yeah, it's 4-foot track, piece of track. So it would have been awesome to get 2 of these, and I could have put it on the entire 8-foot piece. That would have done 2 things. I think it would have made it more rigid on the ends where it has a bit more of the flex. Out kind of in this area is where it flexes a bit more, because this is kind of like a spine that reinforces a little bit. So I could have had that along the whole 8 feet, and then I could have spread these clamps out even further and clamped it more towards the end and more towards the other end on 8-foot pieces. So as of now, I can clamp about, maximum just shy of 4 feet apart. I can put the clamps on a lot of 6-foot boards that I have. It's not a big deal. It covers plenty of this board, but an 8-foot board would be nice to be out a little bit further, and it would tighten up those edges. That only matters as you're starting to feed in to the saw, that at the end out there you don't have a little bit of flex as you start to come in. But hopefully that gave you an idea of sort of that in-feed principle that I was talking about. See, I had a lot of the jig feeding in, making contact with the fence before it started to make contact with the wood. So that's it for our joiner jig. I had this little piece here. I thought I would clarify something. So they sell this in 2 sizes. This is probably about a 1/4 inch or so. So this one's probably 3/8. So they have this one's about a 3/8 piece. I think that's a little bit thin. It's really flexible, but I think it would work, especially in some applications. You'd get some benefits because it wouldn't raise the piece that you're cutting so much more off of the bed of the saw. So you could use this. I haven't used this, so I couldn't tell you how well it works. But I may make another one someday with that, and that would help me on those 2-inch boards. It would help it so that I could get a little bit more clearance height-wise on the blade of the table saw, because this one I want to say is a little bit closer to 3/4 inch. So 3/4 inch helps, obviously, because it gave the screws for the track a little bit more to bite into. You'd have to be worried about that on this 3/8 one. So I think that's what I said this was, 3/8. So I went with a little bit the thicker one. I thought it'd be a little bit more rigid, and obviously give the screws a little bit more to bite. So that's it. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments, and I'll be sure to answer those. Really appreciate everybody taking the time to watch the video. For those of you that comment, I really appreciate that as well. So hopefully this was helpful, and let me know if you have any questions, and I'll be sure to answer them. So thanks again, and we'll see you guys on the next one.